It is likely one day William will be king, but it won't be for another 20 or 30 years. So how is the palace preparing him for the highest rank in the land? Tonight, a story of princely secrets, palace spin, and an heir to the throne accused of doing very little indeed. That's Britain's problem princes and the warnings for the future King William. This is a story of profiteering. The prince who got a plot of protected greenbelt rather cheaply had a house built on it and then sold it to a mystery buyer for as much as £5 million over its estimated market value.
The price was pushed up to 15 million, and I'm sure that the seller's delighted.
It's also a tale of debt, how another prince had his company bailed out by a secret benefactor whose identity remains hidden behind an account in an offshore tax haven.
Should the House of Windsor be getting involved with the British Virgin Islands in any way, shape or form?
We investigate how much we spend on royal security and just how little William actually does as a royal.
Then I think it's right to say, are we spending our money wisely, necessarily?
And we reveal the reality behind the palace claims to have entered a new age of openness and accountability.
They really don't feel that the OIC should be looking at any of this information.
Charles, our next king, was born into an age of deference and privilege. But the world is changing. Prince William was born into an age which expects people to earn their living and account for their income.
Hello.
But can he be the one to drag the British monarchy into this new age?
Prince William is the future of the royal family itself and of the whole concept of the monarchy in the United Kingdom for the next 50 or 60 years. He has the Adonic good looks of his mother. He has in that tragic smile the hopes and fears of a nation, really. He personifies what royalty is all about.
So how is he doing so far?
William, he's doing almost nothing.
Perhaps, above all else, the role of the monarch is to be the focus of national identity, that symbolic cutter of ribbons, that patron of good causes. So just how is William shaping up? Just how hard is he working? We decided to take a look at his diary. In 2007, William completed just 14 royal engagements, and of those, no fewer than 5 were either football or rugby matches. William is 26 years old. Now, when his father was the same age, he had a full-time job in the Navy, but still managed to complete 84 royal engagements during that year. When his mother, Princess Diana, was the same age, she did 200. And in that same year, even the Queen Mother, who was then 87 years old, got through more than 100 royal engagements. So, how did Prince William fare during his 26th year? Well, by the end of October, he completed just 14 royal engagements. That's no better than the year before.
Super.
I'm sorry, but as second in line of succession to the throne, he really should be doing more of them.
By the beginning of November last year, William, perhaps aware of how thin the calendar was looking, began what was for him a hectic week of royal engagements, so we decided to follow him around. The week's engagements began on a Wednesday, though not until 7 in the evening. Into St Paul's for a concert, out again by the back door at 8 o'clock, and off to the Guildhall for a dinner. That's 2 engagements in one evening. The next day, it started at 6 in the evening, with a charity reception just round the corner from his house. And it was over by 8:30. Friday was taken off, and on Saturday, it was to Cardiff for an unveiling and then a rugby match. Woo! The Prince, a noted English supporter, is Vice-Royal Patron of the Welsh Rugby Union, a fact regarded with some suspicion by at least this fan.
I think that's a conflict of interest for him. I think you need to sort that out, really.
William's busy week of engagements came to an end on Remembrance Sunday with 24 minutes at the cenotaph. Remembrance Sunday and the traditional media coverage of it, one of those key national events which consolidates the position of the royal family as a focus in our national life.
The Queen, on behalf of the whole nation, now lays her wreath at the cenotaph.
It is also a chance for the royals themselves, of course, to display their own military credentials.
The Duke of York, who served in Sea King helicopters in the Falklands War.
So no surprise then that for some officials in the palace, the answer to the problem about what to do with William was obvious. He should go, like his father and his uncle before him, into the military. First up, there was a stint in the army at Sandhurst, and then Lieutenant Wales was sent to the RAF.
Flying Officer William Wales.
It was a great day and a great photo opportunity. The day Flying Officer Wales, our future king, earned his wings.
Prince William has learned to fly during a 4-month attachment with the Royal Air Force.
Except that William's Air Force career did not follow the usual pattern. The Ministry of Defence and Palace say he undertook an intensive flying training course involving elementary flying, basic fast jet and single-engine rotary training. To do those 3 courses would take 77 weeks, but William did it in just 13.
His flying training has been extremely compressed. To go from joining elementary flying training at Cranwell in January to passing out midway through the year with wings would be absolutely unheard of. He's simply not qualified to captain a Royal Air Force aeroplane.
Well, the Ministry of Defence were keen to stress there would be no preferential treatment for Flying Officer Wales. And yet most servicemen would be hard-pressed to call to mind a year in service quite like the one Prince William has just had. In March, a week skiing in Closters. In April, a 3-day stag weekend. In May, nearly 2 weeks on holiday in Mustique with Kate Middleton, followed by 4 weeks in July training in the Caribbean, this time with the Navy. In August, it was another 2 weeks back in Mustique with Kate. In October, there was a charity bike ride adventure in Africa. And in November, it was back to the senior service for another tour of duty in the Caribbean.
It's not a serious military career, but at that stage, I don't think William's military career was intended to be serious. It was intended to give him a good look at the services and to prepare him for his role as Commander-in-Chief.
They're making this bizarre excuse that he needs to do this so that, you know, he's ready to be Commander-in-Chief, which is, it's nonsense. I mean, William will also be head of the Church of England. Now he's not going to go off and spend 5 years being a parish priest.
The palace said that Prince William had served as a full-time military officer since 2005, and they added,
During this busy time, he has continued to carry out a number of private and public engagements.
And that he had
met the required standard at which wings are presented on a provisional basis and demonstrated the necessary flying ability.
The MOD told us that William's attachment to the RAF was
part of a wider programme of events designed to prepare him for his future role. It was designed to familiarise him with the RAF, its structure, roles, history and ethos.
But the tabloids' voracious appetite for princely misbehaviour off-duty still threatened to damage the reputation of the monarchy, and so began a programme of rehabilitation. It started with Harry.
There's nothing that the Brits like better than a reformed character who's seen a bit of life, been a bit of a wild boy, immensely charismatic, doing his stuff very traditional royal.
And so began Harry's Afghan adventure. The MOD presented the country's editors with very little choice.
That's BMS.
Unless the press accepted a blackout, security considerations would prevent Harry going to Afghanistan at all. In return, the media knew they'd get some nice pictures on his return.
Hey Roger, just confirm those 2 packs that you've got eyes on.
A sort of faint threat was sort of implicit in the discussion that if the press didn't oblige and do a blackout, then Harry wouldn't be able to go to Afghanistan and the press would be blamed and would come out of it, the bad guys.
Of course, the footage, when it was transmitted, was easier to manage because Harry clearly loves being a soldier and joked about the danger.
Finally, the GBM strikes. That's ginger bullet magnet bullet.
And indeed came near to the real fighting, though not as near as many of the headlines made out.
Success! I love when things go right, especially when you guys are here.
Although some material may be a little prurient for the palace's taste.
trousers about to come down.
He's hung like a horse.
There's no doubt the media blackout handed the palace a propaganda coup.
Not Gay Thursday yet.
But it left some editors determined it would not happen again.
In the case of the Afghan trip, I think without any question the MOD was sort of falling into line with what the palace wanted a little too easily. We are a country obsessed by secrecy, far more than many others. And I think we rushed too quickly into an agreement where you say that actually it's fine to not tell our readers what's going on.
Have a push, please.
The MOD told us that the understanding between them and the media, including Channel 4, was
entirely voluntary
and designed to balance the need for safeguarding the prince and those around him with the need to tell the story. They added that they
utterly reject any assertion of coercion.
But Harry's post-Afghanistan reputation suffered with the press revelation of some earlier, rather less acceptable footage.
A little packy friend. Like a raghead. Look at me. Look at me.
Harry's racist comments have been formally noted on his military record. But the overall success of his Afghanistan tour appears to have encouraged the MOD and the palace to try again with William. The resulting headlines, within a week of William's deployment with the Navy in the Caribbean, failed to convince.
Funny old story the other day about Prince William in the Caribbean. He sort of almost single-handedly busted a cocaine-running ship. But I mean, when you looked at it closely, I think that was far from the truth.
Not all spin can be attributed to the palace, though. Here's William in a craft skippered by a local boatman. And here's the boat by the time it appeared in the Sun. Real naval heroes clearly don't need local help, or even an engine. But having established the princes as warriors, the next stage appears to have been to build up their reputation for compassion. They started by championing the plight of servicemen returning from Iraq and Afghanistan.
It seems to me that the public roles and duties and aspirations of the princes are what we should focus on. And there are plenty of causes that they could adopt at home and abroad, and they wouldn't simply be involved with living it up as private individuals, but they'd be seen as symbols of national solidarity.
It's a policy not without its problems. Take their much publicised 10-day African charity motorbike ride last October.
The money raised today goes towards Nelson Mandela's Children's Fund, UNICEF and Centre Bali, three absolutely brilliant charities.
Centre Bali was the charity set up by Harry in 2006 following a trip to Lesotho in his gap year. There is no doubt that Harry's commitment to the charity is genuine and heartfelt, and that his involvement brought out some of his mother's qualities of charm and empathy.
It's really encouraging to see sort of how everything's improved.
But the charity itself ran into trouble, as reported in the press, when complaints emerged that it had spent too much on administration and not enough on the cause. A charge Clarence House strongly refutes. So by the time of the bike rally, the Prince's spokespeople must have been anxious for some good press. However, when we asked them exactly how much the Princes themselves actually raised for the charities, they wouldn't tell us, except to say it was at least £1,500 each. And to put that figure into context, we calculate that the cost of the Special Royal Protection Squad which accompanied them was around £40,000, though the taxpayer, of course, footed that bill. But with perhaps 2 or 3 decades until William becomes king, the palace desperately needs to find him a meaningful long-term role. As a stopgap, he's remaining in the military and training as a search and rescue pilot. Though this recent report that William may be posted to the Falklands suggests the royal establishment are hoping to revive memories of his Uncle Andrew's glory days as a Sea King pilot in the Falklands War. But as we will reveal in part 2, it's some of Andrew's rather less glorious ventures which hold the real lesson for William. How should the palace solve a problem like William, the heir in waiting? Charles will be king. Few people now doubt that.
Oh, dig that crazy rhythm.
But times are changing and William will have to prove to the public that he will be value for money. And how can he do that? Well, if he wants to know what not to do, he need look no further than the previous spare to the heir, his uncle Andrew. They do have things in common. Like William, Andrew had a military career.
I mean, I think that a small missile, perhaps 18 feet long, can do that much damage.
His Falklands experience helped brand him as a hero.
It's been a wonderful life, and I've thoroughly enjoyed it, but I've got new things to do and new challenges to face.
When he left the Navy in July 2001, the plan was he'd do some royal duties and become an unpaid special representative for UK Trade and Investment, or the UKTI, whilst living on an income ultimately provided by the Queen. But very quickly, it began to go wrong. The press cast him not as an emissary for GB plc, but as the Playboy Prince. And when he wasn't the Playboy Prince, he was Air Miles Andy. It couldn't last. Press and public outrage grew.
The trend is for greater scrutiny of the royal finances, which are looked at by the Public Accounts Committee of the House of Commons, and I think the next civil list will be scrutinised by Parliament, possibly a little more closely than has been done in the past.
One of the men leading that scrutiny is Ian Davidson MP of the Parliamentary Public Accounts Committee.
We wanted to make sure that the travel that the taxpayer was funded, as distinct from their personal travel, was justifiable.
Concerns about Andrew's travel costs led in 2005 to a report by Parliament's National Audit Office. It cleared him of wrongdoing, but did reveal the huge amount spent ferrying him around. Perhaps in response, Andrew's since kept his travel arrangements out of the news. His advisers, like the former minister, Lord Digby Jones, speak admiringly of his work.
The Duke of York is put into play on behalf of the country to go to a market and sell Britain. The Duke of York, in the right territory, in a place where the royal family is understood and liked and revered, is remarkably effective, far more effective than I think people ever understand.
So he's effective, but is he cost effective? Well, it shouldn't be too difficult to find out, because the palace on its website devotes a whole page to freedom of information. It says, amongst other things, that its stated policy is to account openly for all its use of public money. Last year, Andrew himself asked the consultants PricewaterhouseCoopers to assess his effectiveness and value for money. They reported to Andrew last June, but when we asked the palace for a copy, they refused, saying the report's private. So, has Andrew cut down on his travel expenses after all the publicity? To find out, I enlisted some help. Morning, Richard. Good morning. I asked Richard Murphy to examine the account for royal travel over recent years.
I've got the accounts here for the royal household for 2004-05. It's very interesting to note that every journey costing £2,500 or more was put on public record, so we could know what was going on. And then I turned to the next set of accounts I've got, the year 2005-06. And it details journeys costing £10,000 or more. The previous year, £2,500, now £10,000. Of course, a large number of journeys have fallen out of account as a result.
So, far from increasing transparency, it has been reduced. And unless a journey costs more than £10,000, they simply don't tell us about it. And that came as disturbing news to Ian Davidson of Parliament's Public Accounts Committee.
I'm surprised that you're telling me that figure of £10,000. It used to be much lower. I think I'll have to look at that again. I mean, that would seem to be a cause for concern if the intention is to hide a whole number of journeys which cumulatively come to really quite a substantial sum of money. And sliding into secrecy isn't necessarily the best way of overcoming public anxieties.
We asked the palace to account for all the money paid to Andrew on journeys costing less than £10,000. And despite its promise to
account openly for its use of public money,
it declined. So how is Andrew doing now? Take the example of the old Shoreham toll bridge in West Sussex, which Andrew reopened last October. The restoration of the bridge had been a labour of love funded by individual donations, grants and charity events. Shoreham is just 69 miles from Andrew's house. The train would have cost £60.80 first class. But Andrew took a helicopter which, according to one private hire company, will cost about £6,000. As the Shoreham Bridge fundraisers would know, that's an awful lot of jumble sales. But £6,000 is still below that £10,000 threshold, which means we, the public, would not have been told about it.
There has been a tendency amongst the royals, whenever they possibly could, to conceal information or at least not make it publicly available. There's a pattern of behaviour there which implies that they really don't feel that the Oiks should be looking at any of this information.
So what does Andrew really cost us in travel? Well, according to his own declared expenses, in 2005 it came to more than £300,000. But in the 3 years since then, that figure's virtually doubled to more than £700,000. Then don't forget there are all those undeclared journeys of less than £10,000 each. We estimate they came to £170,000 last year. Add to that the travel expenses paid directly by UKTI. So what does it all stack up to? Well, it looks like last year Prince Andrew cost the British taxpayer close on £1 million in travel expenses alone.
I think some of the trips that he's undertaken have been highly dubious, and I'm not entirely convinced at the moment that he's actually got the message that he's got to be more prudent in the way in which he behaves with taxpayers' money.
The palace told us it always pays close attention to costs and
considers safety, security, the need to minimise disruption for others, and the effective use of time and money when deciding the most appropriate mode of transport.
However, to list
the individual expense of more than 3,000 annual engagements across the royal family would represent an unreasonable administrative burden.
They said the increase in Andrew's travel costs since 2005 was because his engagements for the UKTI had doubled in that period. But almost certainly the largest single cost associated with the royal family is security. But it's an expense we are not allowed to know about. Could one reason for that be this? Because the prince's nights of excess, so enjoyed by the tabloid headline writers, actually cost us money.
I think we do get fed up because the minders, the protection officers, they are paid for by us. So if William and Harry come out of a club drunk, they are there to protect them against terrorists. They're not there, really, to fight off newspapers or reporters.
So how do we tell how much we're paying for the protection of our royals on royal duties and how much we're paying for protection officers to keep drunken princes under control, out of the papers and away from the cameras of the paparazzi? Well, no one will tell us. In fact, they won't even divulge the overall cost, arguing it would compromise the security of the royal family.
Apparently terrorists or anybody else that might want to do them harm can work out where the snipers are by knowing how much it costs to pay them. It's a very strange logic, and we can only assume because the figure is very large.
So since the police wouldn't tell us, I went to see Di Davis, who was in operational charge of the Met Police's Royal Protection Squad for 3 years.
If you're going to take 400 or 500 policemen and women and support services and civilian staff, you're talking many, many millions. But I would estimate it must be in the region of 30 to 40 million at least.
And that's just for the Royal Protection Squad. It doesn't count all the costs of the local police forces around the country, called in whenever a member of the royal family goes anywhere, from church or, to the delight of the tabloids, a lap dancing club.
I think the time has come for a serious review of protection of the royal family. When we send out 17, 18-year-olds to Iraq and Afghanistan and allegedly we're not equipping them properly, then I think it's right to say, are we spending our money wisely, necessarily, and will it be effective?
And what makes that question even more pertinent is that Prince William and Prince Harry, with multi-million-pound bequests from both their mother and the Queen Mother, are extremely rich in their own right. But the prince's personal wealth does save them from another of the pitfalls which face their less wealthy uncles: the temptation to try and earn money for yourself by going into business.
He was known as Educated Eddie, I remember. What a joke. He didn't do very well at Gordonston. He didn't do very well at Cambridge. Everything he's done has been fairly disastrous, Edward. And I think they were suddenly left with, what do we do? He went into the, of all things, television business.
Edward launched Ardent, his television company, insisting he would not trade on his royal connections. But that didn't last long. First there was Edward on Edward, and then a press scandal when his film crew was accused of stalking Prince William at university. The Queen stepped in and, officially at least, Edward got out of the TV business. But in fact, it's not as simple as that. Most people have thought that Ardent Productions has long gone. But these are the abbreviated accounts of a company called Ardent International Sales. It's not been particularly effective. It made about £6,000 last year. But what's interesting is that a mysterious backer has invested a large sum, almost £250,000, in this company.
We have this company putting in £350,000. We don't know who it is. It's in effect a loan, and it has a guaranteed rate of interest of 5%, which appears never to have been paid, I'd add. There's over £90,000 owing, and so this company is in hock.
So Edward's company now owes getting on for £500,000. But who to? Well, we just don't know, because whoever it is, they're hidden behind a company which is registered in the secretive tax haven of the British Virgin Islands.
Should the House of Windsor be getting involved with the British Virgin Islands in any way, shape or form?
I think that's extremely unwise, because it always leads to questions and doubt. How did they get their money? Is it legitimate? Why would you set up a British Virgin Islands company? You do it for one reason and one reason alone. Because they are completely and utterly secret.
The palace said that
information in relation to Ardent Productions is private.
But squaring those areas of royal life they've traditionally regarded as private, with modern notions of public accountability, could prove problematic. And that applies not just in relation to how they live, but where. A problem which William will have to confront soon. There's already speculation about where he'll live as he waits for the keys to Buckingham Palace. In pondering their future, William and Kate may well be advised to consider this place. Sunninghill House was completed in 1990 and given to Andrew and Sarah Ferguson as a wedding present by the Queen. It was described witheringly at the time as South York, a kind of Dallas Royal, a palace for the hello generation. But this is Sunninghill today. It lies empty and abandoned. The gate is open, the garden vandalised. The royals have long gone. The story of how this house and estate stopped being something effectively owned by you and me as taxpayers and became instead a private asset sold by the royal family for some £15 million may yet come back to haunt them, because it's a story which is all about opaque deals and special privileges, and it raises serious questions about the accountability of the royal family.
In general, we don't do property transactions with the royals, which might end up to their benefit. We don't tend to do property transactions with the royals at all. So actually selling the prince something at all does call into question a number of aspects of the deal.
This land used to be owned by the Crown Estates Commissioners. Now they're the people who look after the Crown Estates on behalf of us, the British taxpayer. But this document shows that back in 1987, the Commissioners sold the lease for 125 years on this land to a company called Tyrolese 83 Limited. So, who are Tyrolese 83? Well, the company returns show that their directors are two of the Queen's most senior courtiers, her lawyer and the deputy keeper of the Privy Purse. But there's something else, something much more curious than that. The lease that I mentioned shows quite clearly that Tyrolese 83 bought and owned the lease on the land. And yet, if you go along to Companies House and have a look at the public accounts for that company, Tyrolese 83, it states quite clearly, this document, the company has no assets and has completed no transactions. And there's something else. Along the way, the company Tyrolese 83 has changed its name to become Flitcham Nominees. Confused? Well, I certainly was by now, so it was time to go along and see Mr. Murphy again.
It's really quite odd, isn't it? Very strange. And that's because Tyrolese 83 Limited is simply a front company. It never did anything. It was purely a nominee for other people. So the real owners were not that company. The real owners would appear to be a trust which in turn owned Flitcham Nominees Limited. And the trustees appear to be members of the royal household. There is no register of who owns trusts, and their accounts never go on public record. And so we're adding layer upon layer of secrecy into this transaction.
What we do know from this secretive trust is that they paid £100,000 for the lease on this land. Now, the Crown Estates Commissioners are duty-bound to get the best market price for anything they sell. Fair enough, after all, it is taxpayers' money. So is £100,000 a reasonable price? Well, take a look at this. This is the local paper from around the same time, and there's another plot of land, just 2 acres in this instance, with permission to build a house, as opposed to the 6 acres, which is the Sunning Hill plot. And yet the asking price for this is twice as much as Sunning Hill. It's a crude guide, perhaps, but it does suggest that Sunning Hill could have been sold to the royals for as little as 1/6 of its real value as development land.
And in fact, this land was all protected greenbelt. It appears no one should have been allowed to build on it. But for the royals, the council made an exception, citing security considerations.
But there was to be one more event in the long, secretive process. In 2003, another secret trust was allowed to buy the freehold here for £12,000.
The transfer prices at various stages do, I think, require a bit closer examination, just to make sure that the public purse got a fair deal out of this.
Now, in case you're feeling a little confused by all this, let me sum up the key elements. We began with 6 prime acres of protected land, which no normal person would be allowed to buy. But Andrew ended up with it. Of course, no normal citizen would be allowed to build on this land, but they let the Queen do it. The Crown Estate would not normally sell the freehold on land like this, but Andrew got it, and then he sold it for £15 million. And the way he and the trust did that was going to raise the biggest questions of all.
I think the seller got an exceptional price and was very lucky.
Perhaps the most important lesson for William is that these days, as Andrew is discovering, the truth will often out.
That's the problem. If you know where not to be, you always end up there.
In part 3, we discover more royal secrets they'd prefer you not to know.
The royal household could have 20 or 30 years to prepare Prince William for the role of king. But while the House of Windsor can mould the man, it will also need to look at itself and prepare for radical change in its relationship with the nation.
There are crossroads, in my view. They've got to decide whether or not they're going to be personally responsible to the public as a whole, or just simply feel that they're beyond reproach.
Perhaps with that in mind, the palace has promised a new era of openness and accountability. But is it working in practice, especially when things go wrong? The story that William had flown an RAF Chinook to the Isle of Wight for a stag do caused quite a stir, until the Ministry of Defence press machine swept into motion in defence of the Prince. It was, they insisted, a legitimate training sortie,
which tested his new skills to the limit.
Sources at Clarence House were also quoted as saying that his supervisors knew about the trip. But then something unexpected happened. The anti-monarchy group Republic put in a Freedom of Information application for the MOD's internal documents on the affair. These are those internal emails, and they reveal that his supervisors had no idea he was heading to a stag weekend and would not have allowed the sortie had they known. The MOD emails also confirmed that William had landed in his girlfriend Kate Middleton's garden, and that the total cost of his flights that week had been over £86,000.
You would think that if any RAF officer did what William did, there would be serious repercussions. I mean, possibly even a court-martial.
The MOD continued to insist the trip was a legitimate training flight, although they concede there was
a degree of naivety involved in the planning of this sortie.
The palace added that there was no intention to mislead and Prince William had accepted responsibility for what had happened.
But the coverage of the Chinook affair was not, as we have established, an isolated example of what looks like official spin.
Well, it's a charming afternoon for a country walk, not? I'm heading up to North Norfolk to the much-loved country estate owned by the Queen at Sandringham. Just up the road from where we are now, Dersingham Bog. It's one of the last wilderness areas in this part of England, and it's where an unusual incident took place about 16 months ago. it was reported that 2 extremely rare hen harriers had been shot on the Sandringham estate. Now, if that's true, it was extremely serious.
Because rare hen harriers are a protected species. The incident had been reported by a warden employed by Natural England, the government body which runs the Dersingham Bog Nature Reserve on behalf of Sandringham Estate. He'd seen the birds shot out of the sky.
At the time, it was reckoned there were only about 20 breeding pairs of hen harriers in the whole of England, and anybody convicted of killing one could face 6 months in prison or a £5,000 fine. And there was another potentially embarrassing fact, that Prince Harry and his old friend William van Cutsum were in the area on a shooting visit to Sandringham.
Although the police visited the estate, the birds' bodies were never found. But the police did interview Harry and his friend. Now, as you can imagine, the press had a field day. This was potentially a very damaging story. In the end, the story died away, perhaps because of this statement which was posted on the Sandringham Estate website.
Following an inquiry carried out by the Norfolk Police, it has been confirmed that there is no evidence to prove that these birds were in fact shot down.
Except we've discovered that statement appears directly at odds with what the Crown Prosecution Service were saying.
We put in a Freedom of Information request for all emails and documents relating to this incident to Natural England. And amongst the stuff we got back came this. It's an email from an official at the Crown Prosecution Service. And far from going along with the Sandringham version of events on their website, this official says simply, "We were satisfied with the witness evidence that the birds were shot."
But by then it was too late. The palace version was out and the story, possibly like the hen harriers, died a death. The palace said the statement on the Sandringham website
reflects what was said by the Norfolk Police at the time.
They accused dispatches of having
a small and highly selective
part of the story, saying witnesses contradicted the claim that the birds were shot. When it comes to openness and transparency, there's a lesson for William to learn from his Uncle Andrew. This is Kazakhstan. It's a former Soviet state, still governed as something of a personal fiefdom by its autocratic president, Nursultan Nazarbayev.
In Kazakhstan, the judiciary and law enforcement system are corrupt and not independent. The record on human rights is very poor. There have been a number of cases where opposition leaders or journalists have disappeared. This is not in any way a free country. It's a country which has to be treated with great care.
And it's a country which Andrew has visited on 3 occasions in the last few years, in his official role with the government agency UKTI.
And I look forward to coming back to Kazakhstan again in the not too distant future.
Kazakhstan is rich in energy resources, and Prince Andrew has represented the interests of the British gas group and the oil company Shell during his visits, but he's also made personal private trips to the country. On one occasion, he's reported to have enjoyed a weekend hunting trip as a guest of the President and his circle. But should Prince Andrew, as a UKTI special representative working officially for UK PLC in Kazakhstan, be accepting gifts of hospitality from those he's meant to be doing business with on our behalf?
The whole point about doing business in a country like Kazakhstan, which is perceived to be highly corrupt, is that there's huge potential for conflicts of interest. So any representative of the British government should be completely clear where the dividing lines are between what they're doing for the state and everything else. There cannot be any perception of a conflict of interest.
Andrew is the UKTI's only special representative, but the nearest equivalent role is performed by the UKTI's business ambassadors. The rules governing their conflicts of interest are absolutely clear.
Business ambassadors should ensure that their position is not, and raises no reasonable suspicion of being, abused or furthering their own private interests.
Conflict of interest. The golden rule, don't even allow the suspicion or the perception, regardless of the reality, right?
Yeah, and one of the things, actually, that Buckingham Palace are very good at, and something that the Duke of York spends a lot of time on, is sussing that out early. For him, it's not personal interest at all. It's nothing to do with personal reward. It's about the perception of what he's doing when he's there.
Clearly, as far as Prince Andrew is concerned, he does not have any conflicts of interest. The UKTI has confirmed to us that he has not declared to the UKTI any conflict of interest. However, there is evidence Andrew may have a very significant financial connection with one leading Kazakh industrialist, which raises a potential conflict of interest. And the link to that person is a Kazakh socialite and millionaire businesswoman called Goga Ashkenazi. Goga seems to have become a good friend of Andrew's. He even introduced her to the Queen at Ascot in 2007, causing a lot of excitement in the tabloid press. Goga has a child, revealed on this birth certificate, with a man called Timur Kulibayev, seen here with Goga. But Kulibayev also has another relationship.
Timur Kulibayev is the son-in-law of the president. He's married to one of the president's daughters. In his own right, he is an extremely wealthy businessman, yet he's also been the head of state-controlled companies that play a vital role in the economy.
Timur Kulibayev is chairman of Kaz Energy, an organisation which lobbies on behalf of Kazakh oil and gas companies. So what's the connection to Prince Andrew?
Well, it's this place, Andrew's old home at Sunning Hill. In 2003, the whole place was put up for sale by the Royal Trust. The Trust owned it, but we can only assume they were working on Andrew's behalf.
So what would it all have been worth when it was sold back in 2007? Hugh Williams has been an estate agent in Ascot for nearly 20 years.
When we're valuing a property, we look at a certain set criteria. But I would have thought, given the location, the size, and casting aside any previous royal owners, it would be worth around £10 million at the time it sold.
But the Trust put Sunning Hill on sale for £12 million. Despite the royal connection, for 3 years there was no buyer and the house stood abandoned. But the year before last, it was sold, not for £10 million, not 12, but for £15 million.
Well, I think the seller got an exceptional price and was very lucky. Obviously, we don't know what went on behind the scenes, and there could have been a host of reasons why the price was pushed up to 15 million. And I'm sure that the seller's delighted.
So what has the buyer done with his new property? Nothing.
So who would buy a house apparently for £5 million more than it's worth and then not use it? Well, the paperwork shows that the estate was sold to the Unity Asset Corporation. And who are they? Well, somebody wants to keep that a very closely guarded secret, because the Unity Asset Corporation, rather like the company which bailed out Prince Edward when his TV company was in trouble, is incorporated in the British Virgin Islands.
In this interview in Tatler magazine, Goga Ashkenazi is quoted as saying that she introduced the buyer and seller of Sunning Hill. And the evidence suggests that the new owner is Timur Kulibayev, the gas and oil magnate, son-in-law of the Kazakh president and father of her child. There's no suggestion of any impropriety in relation to the sale of Sunning Hill, but given Prince Andrew's UKTI role, this raises questions of a potential conflict of interest. If Kulibayev bought Sunning Hill, then surely Prince Andrew should have declared it. If he did not buy the house, then Prince Andrew should have said so. The secrecy surrounding the sale and the price paid only fuels concern. Mr. Kulibayev did not respond to our approaches.
Does it suggest that there's more to this story than meets the eye? Of course it does. Does the involvement of a BVI company add to our suspicion in that respect? Yes, of course it does. Because there is that air of secrecy, of doubt. And again, this surely isn't something that a representative of the royal family who's talking about trade should be doing. Trade should be open, honest and accountable. And here we have a transaction which is not open and honest, and it's not accountable. Honest in the sense that we know why that price was paid and who paid it.
The palace said that the purchase and sale of Sunning Hill was
entirely a private matter and involves no cost to the taxpayer.
And that there is
categorically no conflict of interest with the Duke's role as special representative.
They added that he'd never personally benefited from his work as a special representative. The Crown Estate said they'd followed the law over the sale of the freehold. The UKTI told us that the Prince is not required to declare any potential conflict of interest and that he had never met Kulibayev on official UKTI business. They also said that his role has
significant differences
with that of business ambassadors, who are required to declare conflicts of interest. Since last November, Dispatches has made 9 Freedom of Information requests to the Palace. The Palace isn't bound by the Freedom of Information Act, but it has vowed to be as open and transparent as possible. Yet to date, many of the questions we put to the Palace still remain unanswered. They told us they
make every effort to be open and transparent, especially with regards to public money.
And on confidential subjects, security and private financial matters.
The royal household is perfectly within its rights to decline to answer these questions.
The Palace faces many challenges in the coming years, not least in justifying itself as value for money. If the monarchy is to maintain the trust of the public, it must embrace a new age of openness and accountability. But whether it succeeds or fails will depend on the actions of this young man.
We're in the 21st century. We have got a monarchy which is over a millennium old. What kind of relevance does it genuinely have to the ordinary lives of people in this country? And I think what he's got to try to connect with is the answer to that question.